Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of News Dose, where I give you the latest news in the gaming world. And this week, a lot of stuff has been happening with PlayStation, but there hasn't been anything more exciting than this for me personally. And that's because Bloodborne 2 may actually have a chance to happen, even if it's just a slight chance, and I'll tell you why in here in just a moment. Also, in other news, a popular game seems to be borderline plagiarized, and of course we will talk about a few other things, but for the moment I really want to talk about Bloodborne 2, so let's get right into it. So, game director and president of From Software, Hidetaka Miyazaki, was interviewed by GameSpot Brazil, and they asked him a few questions regarding the future of Bloodborne. And while he did say that it wasn't up to him on whether or not a second Bloodborne game would actually happen, he also revealed that Bloodborne was his favorite game that he has ever worked on, saying that it left a mark on him. He also had a lot of other glowing things to say about Bloodborne, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back for a moment because he said it's not up to him. Now remember, he's the president of From Software, so it's not up to him though. So who is it up to? And really there's two parties involved here, or at least on the surface, which is Sony and From Software, which teamed up to make Bloodborne. The question then is, would Sony want to do Bloodborne 2? Because I would think if this is solely the decision of Sony, I think that they would absolutely sign up for another Bloodborne game. Bloodborne was very successful both in terms of copies sold and critically, and it's actually the 5th best-selling PlayStation 4 exclusive. Then the fact it was Miyazaki's favorite game to work on, he sounds like he would be on board as well. And based off this interview, he's very passionate about his work, and it's actually his favorite thing to do, which is to develop games. So it would make sense for him to work on his favorite game, or at least I would think so. However, there is a chance that another party is involved behind the scenes that may not want to do another Bloodborne game, which is Kadokawa Publishing, which acquired From Software back in 2014. And a lot of people don't really talk about them or may not even be aware of them. But yes, they did acquire From Software back in 2014. And because From Software has had a lot of success releasing multi-platform games such as Sekiro and Dark Souls, it may not be worthwhile making an exclusive game. I mean, there is a lot more money to be made with multi-platform games in general. I also imagine they can go to about any publisher with From Software games by this point, and we've already seen that with Sekiro being published by Activision, and now they're working on Elden Ring, which is being published by Namco Bandai. And even though we don't know a lot about that game, the fact that From Software is working on it, it's garnered a lot of hype surrounding Elden Ring. So this is where it gets really complicated. Even if Sony and Miyazaki wants to do another Bloodborne game, From Software may not have the time to make it worthwhile, considering they may actually make more money doing multi-platform games, which is what Kadokawa would want. And because Sony owns the Bloodborne IP, From Software can't make a multi-platform Bloodborne, which, if you remember, this is exactly how we got the creation of Dark Souls in the first place, which in many ways played the role of a spiritual successor to the PlayStation 3 exclusive Demon's Souls. They wanted it to be multi-platform, so they made Dark Souls. So now it becomes a thing on whether or not Sony would be willing to make Bloodborne 2 without From Software, and as we've seen, they haven't ever been willing to do Demon's Souls 2, though there is a rumor right now that Demon's Souls might be in the work, or at least a remake, which I talked about in a previous video. But honestly, I don't think Sony's going to do Bloodborne 2 without From Software, and that's just my opinion, but I just don't see it happening. It just seems like there may be a few complications surrounding a Bloodborne sequel, but still, I think based off this interview, there may be some hope for Bloodborne fans that it does get a sequel. If Sony can somehow strike a deal with Kadokawa, assuming they are the head honchos here, then there is a real possibility that a sequel could happen. Maybe they could release it as a PlayStation 5 and a PC title, similar to what they've done with a few of their other third-party games, such as Detroit Become Human. Even then, I know From Software games sell really well on Xbox too, so Sony would have to probably fork over a lot of money to make this worthwhile. Nonetheless, we do have Elden Ring to look forward to, so there is that. In other news, a little game by the name of Enchanted Portals was announced via Kickstarter, and yeah, it looks a little familiar, which has more than just a few people upset. Of course, this seems heavily inspired by Cuphead not only in art style, but the way it plays and how it animates. The thing is, people have put side-by-side pictures together where it looks like they have even copied characters and bosses, and yeah, it does seem in a way like it's borderline plagiarized, and I know that's a pretty harsh word and maybe a little dramatic, but you have to admit the similarities are crazy identical here. On the other side of things, it also looks like it's a fun game, so there is that. But yeah, I think it's one thing to take inspiration from the art style, which is fine, but there may be a little too many similarities beyond just the art. I don't know though, what do you all think? Now moving on, there was some bad news this week as well, and that's because Sony laid off a bunch of people due to more restructuring, and this seems to have affected the European division. This of course is very saddening, but there has been some reports here recently about a power struggle within Sony. Of course you have Sean Layden who just stepped down, but here we are seeing Sony centralize their marketing, and it looks like the American branch will now be in control of this, which is why we're seeing them let go of the European branch. This actually could affect PlayStation in Europe, as the article goes on to say how the European branch marketed Drive Club a lot, whereas the American division did not. So there is some differences between the two divisions, but we'll see how all this plays out. All I know is, I hope all the employees who were affected gets back on their feet as quickly as possible. It's always sad to hear when people lose their jobs, and especially since we know what kind of success PlayStation had this generation. Now the last thing I want to talk about is the Nintendo Switch, because we need to leave on more of a positive note. The Nintendo Switch has continued its huge amount of success and just reached 10 million sold in Europe alone. This is fantastic news, and it's really well deserved. Honestly, I think the Nintendo Switch has a real chance of going down as Nintendo's best console ever, and that's really saying a lot considering their past. Of course, I liked a lot of their old consoles such as Super Nintendo, and I loved the Nintendo 64 and GameCube growing up, but really the Switch has been such a good console. It's definitely been my favorite Nintendo console ever since the GameCube release, and that's well over a decade ago. Anyways though, that's it for this episode, but let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe and bell notification button. Peace out.